let's do this. Thank you very much. That's better.
Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime.
Want to thank you once again for joining us on World Jam Global Radio. I'm your host, and this is Issues Today, going out live from Coventry.
Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime.
Along with the usual, which is myself and my co-host, Dr. David Remay, who we're still trying to get online now.
Care about the system. It was all about survival. It was do or die.
We have live from Israel tonight,
too young and foolish.
Matthew Williams.
I learned my lessons in the streets.
Journalist and
a man I couldn't beat.
Correspondently expert
my feet.
in the fears of Syria, Iraq, and ISIS in particular.
I was getting money. Life is so sweet. Now things have changed. The whole game has been real.
Yeah, you got it once again. We're late.
Don't need no gun in
It's the late show. Once a month we start at 8 o'clock due to some other work commitments I have.
Trying to cope with this.
But we do our best to bring this show to you live and direct each and every single week, right here on World Jam Global Radio.
Already getting my time. I paid for my crime.
Now here's the thing, a few weeks ago we had Carol Becker on the show, and we were live in the Gaza, and we heard about the atrocities that were taking place there, the things that the media don't want you to know.
I paid for my crime.
And I can remember quite a few months ago when, well, a bit longer than that actually, when this whole thing erupted in Syria in particular. You had Putin going in there, Obama sending in his troops, and David Cameron beating his chest. And there was all of this noise going on about how we had to put a stop to ISIS. And we were going to go in there and until we brought it to an end.
But I was nobody's chum. Me and Billy.
But what they actually didn't envisage was the access to media, the access to internet, phones and videos. And the atrocities and the killings of children and innocent people were being broadcasted live around the world. And very soon, the news died down with it.
Already did my time.
Well, tonight we're going to hear what's been going on in Syria while we've had a potential media shutdown right here in the UK and probably across the United States of America too.
Already did my time. Baby, my crime, baby, my crime, baby, my crime, baby, my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. I'm trying to get this felony off my back so I can get my life on track and have the right to vote and live like an ordinary citizen again. This is my message to all of my friends in the pen, statewide, worldwide. There was not a man I couldn't beat. I was good with my hands and very quick on my feet. I was swimming in women. I had girls all over the street. I was getting money. Life was so sweet. Now things have changed. The whole game has been rearranged. I'm a changed man. Don't need no gun in my hand. It ain't about being no gangster. Life is too short to spend it all in jail. Trying to cope with this living hell. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime.
Oh, here's the thing.
I paid for my crime.
Whatever part of the world that you may be in,
I paid for my crime.
What's going on in Syria, what's happening in Iraq, and the rise or the fall of ISIS has a very serious impact on how the rest of us live our lives.
Superfly, but I never got home my own supply. I'm not proud of what I had to do.
After the recent events in Paris, followed by Belgium,
I had to repent. I must admit, I was doing all kind of stupid shit. Now I sit back and think it over since I've gotten older. The life I used to live, I wouldn't do.
We're going to find out exactly what's been going on.
I was so numb, I was a real Forrest Gump, but I was nobody's child.
While our national TV media was shut down.
I was the real Terminator.
Coming to you live right here on World Jam Global Radio's Issues Today.
You out like
conflict in the Middle East.
All you haters. Already did my time. Paid for my crime. Already did my time. Already did my time. I paid for for my crime. Already did my time.
The opening statements are going on right now. He could be facing life in prison. Prison. Prison.
Well. Trying to cope with this living hell. Trying to cope with this living hell. Yes, I am. 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 Trying to cope with this living hell. This living hell. This living hell. This living hell. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
World Jam Global Radio, this is Clarity.
Once again, I want to thank you for joining us on this wonderful Saturday evening, wherever you are. Right here in the UK, the sun is shining. It's still bright, and we've had no rain today. But I do believe, unfortunately, although I've desperately been trying to get hold of him, Dr. David Ramey doesn't appear to be with us at the minute, which is sad because I look forward to his rant, and so do you, each and every week. But let's just hope that he's just delayed and he will join us shortly. As I said, a few weeks ago we did the conflict in the Gaza, or shall we call it the Gaza saga. We had Carol Becker with us, who had some very strong opinions and some facts as to the battle that was taking place right there on what the media didn't want you to see. This week, we go even one step further. We're actually going to the heart of Israel, where we're going to be meeting or speaking with Matthew Williams, who is a journalist and an activist, whose main area of expertise is the conflict of the Middle East. Good evening, Matthew. Are you there?
Good evening, Kervin. It's good to be back on issues today, and I'm looking forward to discussing lots about Middle Eastern conflict, particularly Syria, the developments in Iraq, and the rise of ISIS and their caliphate. It's a very interesting, overarching story which we need to cover today.
Well, you know, the funniest thing is that over recent weeks, possible months, the news itself has been dying down here. We hear very little about what's going on in Syria and even Iraq, unless it's a big atrocity and somebody has let off a really big bomb and there's real, huge numbers of injuries and fatalities. And since Putin himself pulled out of Syria, it's almost been zilch. So
yeah,
why don't you start off by just bringing us up to date with what's going on in Syria, as you know it or as you see it?
As I would see the Syria conflict, it's what we're seeing is what's developed into it's a mix of local, regional, and a global conflict all at the same time. It all started, obviously, the catalyst was the Arab revolutions, which spread across the Middle East. And, we had all these protests, people filling the streets from Egypt to Tunisia to Syria. And what we're seeing now is an extraordinary blend of counter-revolution, jihadism and authoritarianism has replaced and filled the void, this political vacuum. And it's just resulted in this remarkable, geo-regional conflict with Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey. It's drawn in a diverse range of actors with different agendas, and it's fractured Syria, and it's caused an immense number of casualties. We have between 250,000 to 470,000 casualties in total. But it's not just a conflict that's, we see Syria in the news and we think, okay, this is just affecting Syria. How can it possibly affect us? But what we see of ISIS and how they've created a global caliphate, they state they want to create a global caliphate, they use technology. We've seen the ascension of social media across the Arab world. it connects to us in a very, very different way. And obviously it will spread across borders. The conflict is spilled over. And what you now have is much more dangerous in terms of what it presents to us, because it's not a conflict that will necessarily go away for a very long time. Because, Iraq's become decentralized, so is Syria. There's sectarian jihadism, warlism. Those have become the new status quo of all these destabilized and failing states across the Middle East, or collapsed states, as I would like to say. And I think we can go into immense detail on the repercussions and the consequences of that. But what we don't hear so often is that there's lots of Western policy making over. I mean, this goes back a long, long time. It goes back to the Iraq War. It goes even before then. It's a combination of local policies mixed with American policy and Western policy, which has brought about over time what we're now seeing across the Middle East.
Okay, so for me, that just spells out and it gives us an update of where we're at. But who's on the floor? If Putin's gone out, who's managing all of this?
Well, that's the problem. We almost don't know what's going on in Syria anymore. We know that there are key actors, powerful actors. We have Assad, we have ISIS, we have obviously Putin supporting Assad, and obviously the Iranians have gone in with the Revolutionary Guard. So they're and Hezbollah as well, a key proxy of Iran fighting in Lebanon. They're there, but there's over 1,000 different groups on the ground in Syria fighting Assad or each other. And what we see, we look at it as a civil war. Obviously, it naturally is a civil war. We have, Assad pitched against the rebels, but it's much more complicated than that. We have the Kurds. We have an intra-rebel conflict between ISIS and extremist elements of the opposition, supported by the likes of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states. And they've invested themselves in those insurgencies to destabilize Assad. And obviously then you have the Russians and Iranians coming in on the other side. But then you have the Kurdish question, which is spilled over into northern Turkey, and that's recognized the long-standing Kurdish conflict with Turkey, with the PKK, and that's gone into Iraq as well. I mean, it's almost an impossible situation to explain it in some ways, but you can make sense of it if you delve into it a little deeper. And I feel like there's lots of questions that still have to be answered, and the consequences are staggering, and we're looking at a generation-long conflict, and ISIS is part of that. But we present ISIS as this faceless enemy, but we see it in Libya, we see it in Afghanistan, even we see it attacking European cities. But all we have to remember is that ISIS, like this insurgency we're looking at against Assad, it's not a monolithic entity. Each region it fights in is rooted in contextual grievances, war economy, and problems with state authority. And often state authority has often been the cause of catalyzing, the conflicts with these groups like ISIS and, nourishing extremism. But yeah, I mean, how do you explain Middle Eastern politics? What becomes logical becomes illogical, because everyone is, you have Obama supporting the Kurds and they're investing a lot of weapons into the Kurdish front. At the same time, you have Turkey working against ISIS and against the Kurds. I mean, that in itself is a microcosm of the conflict that's unfolding in Syria.
And part of that doesn't make much sense to the rest of us, because for us, you'd have imagined that if NATO, if the United Nations, if the Allies were coming together to try and bring peace into the region, you'd have imagined that they're all fighting or they're all supporting one side. But that's not the case, is it?
That's what's presented in the mainstream media sometimes, Kervin, and it simplifies a very complicated situation. And I think, well, how can I say it? Western policy making in the Middle East, and in particular their response to Syria, has been a disgrace. I mean, there's no two ways about it. I mean, it could be looked at as one of the biggest mistakes in history, but what happened in Iraq between 2003 and 2000 9/11. That was a clear policy. But if you go back even further, you can see that policies are being recycled that simply aren't working. I mean, we present the opposition as a moderate force, and that needs to come to the table to fight us up. But the problem is the opposition forces, the so-called moderate forces that David Cameron will talk about in Parliament, the ones that France and Belgium want to work with, and the Turkish want to work with, they are deeply rooted with extremists. You have Jabhat al-Nusra. ISIS. They came to dominate the movement back in 2013, 2012, and eventually you had a split between ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra when ISIS came in through Iraq to join the Syrian war, and then you had a civil war between the opposition group over which doctrine was more radical, and how it was basically a conflict over strategy and tactics. So we have, there was a document released, for example, very recently in 2015, which talks about, it basically lays bare the reality of what's going on in Syria. And if that's okay, if I can read it out.
Go ahead.
It was the publishing of a document from the US Defense Intelligence Agency dated 12th of August, 2012. So we all may be thinking, wow, 2012, that was before ISIS stunned the world with their assault into Iraq. They'd long been embedded in the Syrian civil war, but that captured our imagination, caliphate being established. But okay, so it was published by Judicial Watch, and not only does this document anticipate the rise of ISIS, but it also seems to suggest it will be a welcoming prospect from the perspective of the international coalition seeking regime change in Damascus. So Western policy, as we saw in Libya with the deposition of Gaddafi, the deposition of Saddam Hussein, we have consistently been promoting regime change across the Middle East. But obviously it keeps backfiring on us. And this is what the document says. In 2012, development of the current event into proxy war, ... Opposition forces are trying to control the eastern areas adjacent to western Iraqi provinces, Mosul and Anbar, so where ISIS in 2016 are currently situated. In addition to the neighbouring Turkish borders, Western countries, the Gulf states and Turkey are supporting these efforts. This hypothesis is most likely in accordance with data from recent events, which will help prepare safe havens and international sheltering, similar to what transpired in Libya when Benghazi was chosen as the command centre of the temporary government. AC, this is the key one. If the situation unravels in northern Syria, there is the possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality in eastern Syria. And this is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition want. So Turkey, the Gulf states, US, who are obviously supporting the Gulf states and Turkey, in order to isolate the Syrian regime. So the consequences of promoting regime change have not been damaging to Western security. It's promoted war in the region, and it's led to a massive destabilization process, which either is a big miscalculation or it's intended policy. It's interesting.
Very, very interesting. And we've heard about Turkey, we've heard about the US, and even before Putin left, we heard a lot about him. But where are the Syrian people in all of this? What are they saying?
Well, the Syrian people, that comes into it. We assume Western policymaking, Paris, Washington, and stuff like that. We're saying the Syrian people have to, that Assad has to go. That was our staple, stand. Assad must go. And we've blind debate. What a Syrian official almost said a couple of years back was that we've gone too far up the tree, almost in saying that Assad will go to go all the way back down, when we realized, oh no, we've unleashed a murderous neo-Wahhabist resurgent Al-Qaeda group. ISIS basically used to be Al-Qaeda until it split from Al-Qaeda. We unleashed them, and basically we can't almost go back on that. How does the Syrian people feature in that? Well, we don't assume that the Syrian people have a voice in whether they want change or not. We just assume that, the liberal democratic regime change for the Middle East is the best option. But this is what annoys me each time.
Who presumes that?
Well, Western policymakers. We assume that with Libya, we assume that with Iraq under the Bush administration, that the end game for the Middle East, to to catch up with Western society is obviously deposing of authoritarian regimes across the Middle East. But what we're seeing, even though Assad isn't gone, we've seen the consequences of us covertly meddling in Middle Eastern affairs. But what we did in the Iraq War, was we did it very openly. But each time it keeps backfiring, and it keeps producing harrowing results on the ground for the Syrian people. I mean, the stories coming out of, the personal stories are just tragic,
They got it so catastrophically wrong in Iraq, right? They got it so catastrophically wrong in Iraq, trying to demand change and trying to put in something that they felt was going to be their answer to democracy for the Iraqi people, which turned into an absolute nightmare, not just for us, but for them too, and Iraqis as well. What makes them think that doing it again in Syria is going to be any different?
Well, I can't exactly give the answer to that, but I think it's just nowadays government is very detached from. Oh, well, no, I wouldn't say just the government. We can't just go into this debate saying, we have a ruling class elite who just have their own interests. I mean, it's geopolitics that come into it, but I also think Western society has become very desensitized to the fact that we're recycling policy. I mean, the Middle East is one of the most complicated regions in world history, and trying to understand that and present that very simply is very difficult. But how can they think they can? Well, that's the problem. We don't understand the consequences of those problems. And, we see Assad as the key problem. I mean, yes, Assad is a huge, huge problem. I mean, as I was saying earlier, local problems are very much attached to global problems now. But the refugee crisis has been produced by the Syrian civil war is in part our responsibility. And the way we're reacting to it is showing the hypocrisy in this long-standing narrative that spreading liberal and democratic values are the fundamental core of Western values. Such a narrative, in my opinion, is an illusion. And I think it's packaged and sold to us almost. I mean, it was done in the Iraq War where, we're bringing democracy to these people, and instead you have a sectarian. Well, I wouldn't say sectarian. It's far more complicated than that, because I think the Iraqis are a very passionate people. They're a very national, they believe in Iraq. I mean, we saw with the destruction of the Green Zone, well, the occupation of it even, through a peaceful process, that there is more to Iraq than long-standing tribal hatreds. It's not as simple as that. But we're trying to create some. Yeah, this is the problem, as I was saying. We believe we've been packaged and sold this long-standing narrative that Western way is the end game, but at the end of the day, each government has its own interests, and you can see the return of almost, state policies. We have to look after ourselves. There's geopolitics involved that cut much deeper than that. The problem is we're not asking those key questions anymore, because we have very unstable allies. I mean, we demonize Iran. Iran has violated huge amounts of human rights. I don't deny that. Nor Assad is someone who I deeply, dislike for what he's done to the Syrian people. But at the same time, we just present Putin. I'm not a Putin sympathizer. I'm just saying we present them as the enemy. But we're not looking at the fact that our policies are equally as damaging, and we have as much blood on our hands for what's happening across the Middle East as they do. In fact, probably more so.
Here's a thought. And I'm not sure why they don't even take it on board. But how could we go in with our perception of democracy? How could we go in with our perception of principles and morality? How could we go in with our way of living and impose it on a people whose total infrastructure of religion and beliefs are totally contradictory to those very things that we're trying to impose on them? How can that ever bring about a peaceful solution, or even see us as the bearers of gifts, so to speak?
Well, it's a complicated one, that one. But why do we believe that? Well, as I was saying, it's an end game. It's something which started in the 1990s almost, when the Cold War ended. With the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a grand perception about, the New World Order pronounced by George Bush Sr., hearkening in this New World Order where, there'll be peace and, democracy had clearly won the end game. Obviously capitalism was the big winner against, communism. And that belief has been sustained, and catastrophically so, almost, because we believe that obviously, market liberalization, all these sorts of things are the right thing. What instead has happened is, history doesn't end. History keeps going. History repeats itself. And what you see is that Western institutions themselves are mutating. They're changing. It's become almost in a liberal democracy we live in nowadays, where there's the concentration of wealth into the hands of very few. There's just a disengagement from the millennial generation with that, but you can see it happening all over the world. But trying to impose, obviously we keep trying to reimpose that agenda. I mean, it's difficult. I mean, you can go into conspiracy theories. Personally, I don't believe in them, but it's just a repetition of mistakes. But the Middle East is far more complicated than that. And obviously you're right. We try to bring Western values and stuff like that. And I'm sure there are lots of people who do want a democracy. I think we've seen that with the Arab revolutions, that people wanted regime change, they wanted change, they wanted a different alternative. But I think it was also anti-Western revolutions as well, because we must remember that Mubarak, the original Egyptian dictator who was removed, lots of these authoritarians, including Saddam Hussein, used to be Western proxies in the Cold War.
Absolutely.
We forget that very easily. So we claim to be supporting these Arab revolutions, but in fact, we seem to be unable to detach from the narrative that, other ways are possible. I mean, look at, as I say, the Green Zone. Muqtada al-Sadr was leading Shiite militia groups in the Iraq war to fight against the American occupation. And now he's leading a reasonably peaceful movement trying to promote a cohesive national Iraq. Well, that's, it can still be a nation, but it might not necessarily be a democracy as we would envisage it. I mean, if you think about it, look at Iran, for example. It operates as both a democracy and a theocracy at the same time. And that's just how things operate in specific regions of the world. And I think it's in our interests to keep trying to shore up regimes that are despised by the local population, or at the same time trying to depose of them when all you will have is chaos. Iraq and Syria are exact examples of that chaos that's happening. We're seeing basically all the worst elements of Middle Eastern politics emerging because of our support both for authoritarianism and at the same time, we don't have an alternative to replace that. So that's chaos. I mean, there's always going to be political order. There's always going to be there's no such thing as failed state, because political authority will find itself, but we don't know what form that will be. So what are these worst elements we're seeing? We're seeing sectarianism. That is generally starting to become a very dangerous, thing appearing in the Middle East. We have tribalism, we have jihadism, we have warlordism. These are all becoming, they're forming mini-states, they're going to be forming, caliphates, or some of them will just be benefiting from the war economy, because I think some of these actors see instability as a way to gain power, and wartime power structures are in their interest. So that's partly why in Syria and places like Iraq, it's very difficult to find a lasting solution, because people are vested interest is in violence now. And the consequences are, it doesn't just occur in Syria and Iraq. You can see it happening in places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen. Yemen, we don't even talk about Yemen anymore, which is on the brink of famine. And Al-Qaeda and the in the Arabian Peninsula, a branch of Al-Qaeda. They established a mini caliphate, and no one was even talking about that. I mean, it's been uprooted slightly because the Saudis and its coalition managed to push them out of a key ported city. But you can see that different forms of political order are forming across the Middle East that aren't necessarily state authority. And now that is dangerous in itself because you can't necessarily control that. And you can see those attacks across Europe are a consequence of such instability.
Wow. Now, here's the thing. We're supposed to have gone in to help. And to the ordinary layman, right? The guy who sits down at home on his armchair on a Saturday evening and waits to put on the news before he watches Match of the Day, or the fellow who just comes home from work having had a hard day's work and wants to watch the 6 o'clock or the 7 o'clock news or whatever it is, as he puts his feet up waiting for the dinner to warm up or whatever. To us, what we see is the Middle East has been affected far worse by our involvement than whatever state it was in before we went in. How do we, as a people, answer for the fact that over 250,000, that's 250,000 Syrians have lost their lives in 4.5 years of armed conflict, which only began with an anti-government protest?
Yeah, I believe it actually started out with 3 boys just graffitiing anti-regime slogans. But how did it come to this? I mean, how are we answering for it? We are answering for it. You can see it. Our society's changing for worse.
It's almost as if these people were crying out for help, right? Were crying out for help and weren't necessarily asking for our help at the time. They were just protesting against their governor and they wanted change. And it's almost as if somebody from the outside says, well, how can we manipulate this and take advantage of that? Because what we have seen is just outpouring of an absolutely terrifying ordeal for, I mean, some people are calling it the greatest exodus since World War II.
It is.
So many people being displaced, losing their homes, and then never mind those that have lost their lives.
Yes. I believe it's 7.5 million internally displaced in Syria and over 4 million refugees.
11 million others have been forced from their homes as forces loyal to President Bashar al-Assad and those opposed to his rule battle each other. 11 million. Yeah,
it's amazing, isn't it? And we complain about the amount of people that are coming through into Europe. Oh, look at Lebanon and Jordan. They are breaking almost under the amount of refugees they've taken in. And it's amazing, like, even demographics are changing Europe, and also at the same time they're changing the Middle East for the worse because, well, displacement does that because you have Syrian refugees blending with Palestinian refugees in Lebanon is going to cause be potential for a future conflict if Hezbollah and Israel start fighting again. I mean, Third Lebanon will be catastrophic for the region. I mean, the scenarios are pretty scary and terrifying at the same time. But you can, as I was saying, we are paying for this. So that's the thing. ISIS, all these attacks across Europe, Brussels, the refugee crisis, we're catching the sparks of the Syrian civil war, the Iraqi conflict. And the problem is, though, it's the way we're reacting to them. Instead of, asking the questions, why? We just assume it's just because they hate us, but we're not asking the questions, okay, why do they hate us? Why would ISIS be motivated to attack us? Why would Al-Qaeda be motivated to attack us? I mean, if you look from their perspective, they have lots of good reasons because Western policymaking has just ravaged the Middle East, especially the Arab world. And obviously, I don't support ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their beliefs, but they're not just all psychopaths and madmen. They just have a very distorted different way of looking at the world than we do. And lots of these actual people attacking us in Brussels, Paris, London, Madrid, lots of them are homegrown. So there's a general frustration there in our societies and how the way we're addressing the conflicts.
Okay, well,
so
at the end of the day, some people might say, well, okay, on the other hand, it was only when the security forces opened fire on the civilians who were protesting did this situation in Syria, for example, start to escalate to a point where it got international attention. And then you're talking about people crying out. Because I want to be careful here. If I remember it well, I could remember for weeks, possibly months, nobody was intervening, and the people of Syria were crying out, "Why don't somebody come and help us?" I can remember those news bulletins.
Yes.
So the Syrian people who were coming under attack from the security forces were asking for help in
a Western intervention.
Yeah. They were screaming out for it in order for them to overthrow the government and win back their country. That was the general call. But that's not actually what's taken place, though, has it?
Well, no, obviously didn't happen. I mean, it was badly timed by the West, and by the time they were starting to invest themselves in the Syrian conflict in 2012, you could already see the, splintering and radicalization of the opposition grouping. I mean, you had the Free Syrian Army, you had the development of Salafist groups within the Syrian opposition, and slowly but surely Turkey and the Gulf states started funding those groups more. And obviously, the Syrian insurgency in many ways is like the Iraqi insurgency. They're just divided. It's like they're not going to win this conflict because Assad has been not long prepared for an uprising, but he's more well equipped to respond to an insurgency. And splitting that insurgency, he also released jihadists. I don't deny that. And he's also, you see that split within the opposition. They don't have a cohesive core objective where they can basically replace the government. Instead, they started fighting each other. And basically, our response has been too little, too late. And also, it's not just Western policymaking. I think it's the capacity of Western policymakers to have less ability even to influence those conflicts anymore. Because, like I say, even allies such as Turkey and the Gulf states are starting to lose faith in Western policymakers and their interests in the region, because we're detached from it almost because of the Iraq War. We're afraid to even engage with. We've basically gone from the extreme of one end, where we're engaged completely, but that was really bad, as Iraq showed. And at the other end,
sorry, I'm here.
Yeah, and then at the other end of the spectrum, we almost disengaged at precisely the wrong point, and then instead it's turned into a sort of covert war where we're backing one side against another, right, instead of trying to come to a cohesive solution. I mean, the Russians have been allied with, before they were the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation has been allies with the Syrian regime since 1946. I mean, if you flip the scenario and it was Saudi Arabia in that position, we'd also be pretty annoyed if you were trying to upset the regional balance of power by enforcing regime change. So the Russians have very good reasons to be supporting it, not just historically but temporarily.
What was Russia's real agenda? What was their agenda stepping into Syria? Protecting who and against what?
Russia's agenda, I'd say, would be an interesting one. To stop the Assad regime from falling. I mean, Putin was very much against the deposition of Gaddafi because it produced really dire consequences for that reason. I think I'd say it's factoring into geopolitics. I mean, I wrote an article about it a few months ago, but Putin has very strong interest in keeping the Assad regime up because, one, they have, their military bases there, long established, relationship with the Syrian regime. Sorry, excuse my poor English. and also, Iran has those interests there because they don't want, because lots of the opposition against Assad is Sunni nationalists, Sunni extremists, also Salafists. I mean, the idea for Iran of a very unstable Sunni state just on the border of Lebanon, where their allies Hezbollah are operating, is something they won't allow to happen. Russia also have that interest in consolidating Assad because they don't want another Western pawn to, replace Assad. I mean, it's geopolitics, all of this that's happening. And obviously, Putin doesn't like the West so much. I mean, he's disillusioned with them. And I think he's been very clever in what he's done by getting ISIS have emerged. And basically, Putin has gone into Syria saying, all right, we're going to keep up the Assad regime because they're actually on the back foot. So he's used that excuse to fight ISIS, but he's also bombing the rebels at the same time. But he's also managed to get the West into agreeing to abandon the opposition almost. It's really complicated, but, he wants them to basically, Assad wants to bomb predominantly the opposition, and you have actors like ISIS, but Putin has made the West realize that ISIS is the core enemy, but at the end of the day, he says, the opposition has to go because they've also been affected by ISIS. They've been contaminated almost. So he's basically exposing the West for, its failed policies and the hypocrisy he always believed it was. It's very, very interesting.
We had Judith Poe, the mother of Serena Shim, on the show just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
And that was an absolutely tragic, what we refer to as a murder of an American nationalist journalist who was out there. May have been, her father was from Lebanon, but she was an American citizen. But part of her story and part of what we got in that particular show was that where it was referred to that they wanted you to believe that she was on her way home to the hotel, but in fact she was actually on her way to Syria. But she had already released a story about the fact that she had spotted World Food Organization food trucks transporting militia militants across the border into Syria, right? And that would have been with the knowledge of the UN, the American governments and everybody else who would have been tracking the World Food Organization, food that was meant to be going to the refugees. Have you heard much on that score as to who is supporting, not supporting the ISIS in particular?
I haven't heard that particular story, but I didn't understand the question. Sorry.
Right. Well, the bottom line is America, Turkey. All of them would have been aware of the World Food Organization's transportation being used to ferry these militant terrorists across the border. So, what I'm looking at is how much of a role do these countries play in supporting the very regime and organization that they're trying to have us believe they're fighting against?
The Assad regime. I'm not sure. I would say I haven't heard enough about that story, so it's difficult for me to comment, I think. I can't comment on that.
Okay, I was throwing it in there because it just when you're looking at the statistics that are coming out of Syria at the minute, for me, I'm not, okay, I present a show, but during the week I go to work, I live a normal life, I have a family, I try to keep up with the news, I love my football, you know what I mean, so I try to keep up with the football scores as well, you know what I mean. By the way, the Arsenal ladies beat the Chelsea ladies today in the final, and all, you know what I mean, but we are starved of the real hardcore international news that's going out there, and we have to rely on covert journalists like yourself, like the Serena Shims of this world, who are on the ground Carol Becker and people like that. You guys are on the ground seeing for real what's really taking place. And what you're seeing is a totally different scenario than the one that the world media would have us believe is taking place. So,
Yes.
so when we hear presidents and prime ministers of reputable, respected countries standing there talking about what their fight is against, and then Serena Shims can release a story that the very vehicles of transportation that are supposed to be used to transport food to the needy and the hungry are actually transporting the very same militants that those countries are meant to be protecting those people that the food was meant to be going to against. That's
Yeah.
Do you understand the whole hypocrisy of all of this? The mix of this, because we wouldn't get to hear these type of things if the Serena Shims of this world didn't lay their lives on the line to expose the corruption that's taking place right before our very eyes. And I'm sure from where you are, right there in Israel and in the heart of Syria, there is things that you're going to be able to reveal, I hope, that will show the same level of hypocrisy that they're trying to shove down our throats, trying to get us to believe that they're all for the better good and the greater good.
Yeah, I mean, okay, we're talking about militias being stored into, what was it? The World
Food Organization.
Yeah, the World Food Organization smuggling in. It's nothing. It's nothing new. I mean, we had the Ministry of Health, for example, in Iraq back in 2006, 2007, when the civil war broke out again, following the destruction of targeting Shiite mosques. In the Ministry of Health, that was run by a sectarian militia, and eventually the US had to shut it down. But half the time, the US were turning a blind eye to the torture conducted by these militias because they were supporting a Shiite-dominated government. It's just, partly it's war, First casualty of war is truth, is what they always say, and I think it still stands today. Lots of things nowadays are quickly shoved down our throats, and we move in such a world that goes so quickly nowadays that's very difficult to go deeper into those stories and try to find the contradictions, the recycling of policies, the recycling of similar stories about, how we should see the world. I mean, and the consequences of that are dangerous in the long term in how we address the problems facing us. But the West has always had a big role in supporting lots of these Shiite. I mean, you saw the WikiLeaks papers that spilled lots of really shocking information on how we've supported militia groups, jihadists. I mean, for example, also, we talked about Iraq as well. We talked about Iraq and how militias were conducting sectarian slaughter, torturing and murdering Iraqi civilians, supported by the US government, or the US turned a blind eye to it. History has demonstrated the dangers of deliberately turning a blind eye to arming radical state and non-state actors. Look at the Soviet war in Afghanistan. So, I was reading, according to TV Poll, from 1982 to 1989, conservative estimates suggest that the United States supplied $5 billion to the Mujahideen directly and around $5.7 billion through their ally Pakistan. This author goes further, arguing that thousands of young Muslim men who came from all over the Arab and Muslim world for training by the Pakistani military would later become the backbone of Al-Qaeda. So that's another example of where it's short-term geopolitics without an eye for the long-term consequences of those policies. Now, I mean, what happened when we supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and didn't have a problem, solve it afterwards? Afghanistan and Pakistan became havens for transnational and regional extremists, terrorists, and radical insurgents, and that culminated eventually in the horrific events of 9/11. Well, you can see the parallels in Syria as well. You can see that ISIS have emerged. We're supporting an opposition group that's fighting, an authoritarian state, but we're blindly arming them and just crossing our fingers to hope that they're moderate opposition, when in fact, Jabhat al-Nusra, ISIS, and lots of these fundamentalists have started to dominate the group as opposed to the people who want democracy and moderation. I mean, we're just repeating mistakes. And you do start to ask yourself, why can't we change those policies? We should be able to. I mean, I don't deny we've almost gone far too down the rabbit hole to change things. I mean, we're too attached to the Syrian conflict now that we need to be engaged there. But we need new ideas of how to solve it, because we can't just keep presenting ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and all these, opposition groups, these terrorist organizations as monolithic entities. As I say before, they have different agendas and different, contextual things affecting how they think, different politics. Al-Qaeda in Algeria, for example, will be far different in its outlook to Islamic State in Iraq. And ISIS operating in Afghanistan will be very, very different to what it is in Libya or Syria and Iraq. I mean, we just need to change how we address these states are still a huge part of the problem, not the war on terror. Terrorism is one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. I mean, it goes on and on.
But the conflict in the Middle East is even far deeper than that, because it seems to me that it's in somebody's interest that none of these regions have peace with each other.
Yeah.
Right? As soon as one war ends with one country and another, another one starts.
You're absolutely right. And I think that's actually, you brought up a very interesting thing. This is why there's so many anti-Western narratives formulating across the Middle East, because precisely the fact that lots of people will say, they're waging war on Islam because they don't want it to be strong. They want to destroy Islam. They want to weaken Islam. Now, that's a very skewed narrative because it's much more complicated than that. But these narratives will feed off each other. But at the end of the day, there are very specific interests for the Middle East, for the Western powers in having a weakened Middle East. We obviously oil will come into it. But obviously there's been, we're still feeling the effects of the Cold War legacy. Mm-hmm. We're in a post-Cold War world now. We're not in a new world order which is dominated by democracy. We're just experiencing the consequences of the Cold War. And obviously the authoritarian regimes established by lots of Middle East, all those alliances formed with those dictatorships are starting to crumble. And obviously we don't... even the Obama administration, the West, is at odds with what to do about it, because, what replaces authoritarianism is even worse potentially. I mean, we're now in that really awkward situation where we have to say the enemy of my enemy is my friend almost, and we have to support Assad and what he's done to the Syrian people, but at the same time, ISIS isn't exactly, the best option we want. And the question is, how do we solve that? I mean, Iraq's got exactly the same problems as Syria in some ways. Libya, Yemen. I mean, so why would we want to see a destabilized Middle East? A weakened Middle East. Economic interests, long-standing religious conflict, containment, and just short-term policy. Containing Iran. Iran's been in the agenda, been in the sights of Western policymakers for such a long time now that for example, look, we supported Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq war. He committed genocide against the Kurds. He used chemical weapons indiscriminately against Iranians and Kurdish. We supported that, and German. Chemical industry, the American chemical industry thrived off of that. So there's, like I say, we've got a big economy that, feeds off violence and war. But as I say, that's the point. Look at Assad. He was accused of using chemical weapons against his own people, yet we wanted to intervene. Yeah. But when Saddam did it, and the Cold War politics and our, dislike for the Iranian regime meant our priorities changed somewhat. So the reason, I'd say that's the core reason. There's economic interests there, and there's also, contemporary geopolitics that we want to weaken. And at the moment, we've gone from Cold War politics to regime change. But the problem is we still believe that regime change will bring democracy to the Middle East it won't. It will make things worse, especially as we're, Britain and America are some of the most hated countries in the region now because of what we've done to places like Iraq. And our blind support almost for Israel without criticism. I mean, I know it's more complicated than that, and Israel's a completely different topic, which we have discussed before, but we blindly supported Israel because obviously that is also a very big asset to have in a region that's just always ripped apart by turmoil, war. But then we also support Saudi Arabia and also Turkey. So we support all these different actors, but we haven't adapted. We haven't changed that. We're just keeping in place old policies, which, won't stand the test of time because the world we live in is changing immensely. And I think trying to, keep the old, the news coming in is a very volatile procedure, which is backfiring on us. Regime change involved. Regime change included.
So we go for regime change. Okay, let's just suppose let's just say for playing this out sake, we are successful in getting a regime change. What is the regime that we're looking to replace it with?
Well, that's the point I always bring up with people. People are always lambasting Assad, and I don't doubt he's committed war crimes against humanity. He's killed more people than Islamic State have ever killed, and I agree he has to go. But at the end of the day, you have to think almost like a Machiavellian sometimes, or a realist. Who's going to replace him? ISIS? If you replace Assad, or look, what happened when we replaced Saddam? The country deteriorated into sectarian, jihadist, and tribal civil war. The exact same thing has happened in Syria, and it would. What
we're actually seeing in Syria is a direct result of what we did in Iraq.
Well, they're different in some ways, but you can see the sort of same trend. That's I compared the Syrian insurgency to the Iraqi insurgency. It's divided. It can be extreme. They don't have any sort of core objective. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, that's fine.
That's the point, Iraq and Syria are almost parallel. I mean, each conflict is feeding off each other at the moment. And also it is partly a direct result. I mean, we look at ISIS. I mean, that's a long history in itself where it's basically the product of decades of misplaced policy, not just by Western policymakers, but by also local policymakers like Saddam, obviously, had lots of interests in decentralizing Iraq. Because
let's look at ISIS for a moment, shall we, Matthew?
Yeah.
In your knowledge, in your opinion, with your expertise and the resources that you've had available to you, what and when was the birth of ISIS?
I could start with that story. It started decades ago, and it's a culmination of different series of events which have resulted in the most horrific outcome. But yeah, I mean, it started with people usually say it goes back to the 1940s, but I'd say the most clear-cut development was the Afghanistan war when the Soviet Union invaded back in the 1980s. You had the development, how would I say this? I mean, we look at Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda emerged eventually, after the Mujahideen, it originated from that. You had Bin Laden, you had Zawahiri leading it, but then you had the development of Baghdadi, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and Abu Musabi al-Zarqawi in Afghanistan. Now, this is very useful in understanding the structure of ISIS. So, in 1999, following his release from prison in Jordan, Zarqawi returned to Afghanistan, where he and Baghdadi began to live and work together, operating as close partners in Kabul and Herat in Afghanistan. Baghdadi had very close relations with the Taliban during these years in Afghanistan, as did Zarqawi. We know Zarqawi is. We always look at Zarqawi as the person who created ISIS, which he partly did. But the two Arabs, Baghdadi and Zarqawi, shared the Taliban sectarian hatred of Iranians and Shiites. So people usually say that Baghdadi took over from Zarqawi in June 2006 when he was killed by US airstrike. But Baghdadi's association with the creation of ISIS started in Afghanistan, where he and Zakawi and Baghdadi had a really bad relationship with bin Laden and Zawahiri because they had different views on how to implement their radical agendas. So their pan-Islamic nationalism and neo-Wahhabist doctrine. So this strange relationship obviously was, there was compromise that had to be made by Zakawi and Baghdadi because obviously bin Laden funded them. You can't exactly say to your boss who's funding your operations, I want to do this in a different way when he has a different idea of how things should be done. But obviously, after 9/11, things changed. The US came in and invaded Afghanistan in 2001, deposed of bin Laden, and he fled to Pakistan. And then Zakawi, obviously, and Baghdadi fled through Iran and somehow found their way to Iraq. Now, this is where they start to establish a very murderous group. But it's such a long story. Basically, this division started to emerge, and Zakawi basically established a cell called, how do I pronounce it? Al-Qaeda in Iraq, yeah. They basically named it Al-Qaeda in Iraq because it was incorporated by bin Laden eventually into their wider insurgency. The problem was that Zakawi ruled through fear, but without incorporating the political and economic interests of local insurgents. Because we must remember, the Iraqi insurgency, much like the Syrian insurgency we're seeing today, it's not just extremists, and it's dominated by extremists, but they all have different agendas. They're local insurgents, they're tribes, they're clans, and obviously Zakawi had a very violent way of dealing with people who disagree with him, and that eventually led him to be alienated, and Al-Qaeda eventually got driven underground. What Baghdadi did, he had a fundamental hatred of Iraq's Shia-dominated government, which is undisputed, as did Saddam Hussein. The problem is there's so many different strands. Okay, so we have the US invasion, obviously. They deposed Saddam Hussein, and we immediately assume that, we created Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which we partly did. But we look at Baghdadi. He was a Iraqi, much like Saddam Hussein. He understood the fundamental importance of maintaining a system of terror and enticement. So dependence and conformity, strong patronage networks, and these tenets formed the backbone of Saddam's regime in its final decade in power, following Washington's obliteration of Iraq's socio-economic fabric and infrastructure in the First Gulf War, and the subsequent international sanctions. And obviously, Baghdadi had strong links with the former Ba'athist regime because he came from a similar tribe to Saddam. So we see ISIS as just a terrorist organization, but actually it's our mistakes as well from the Iraq War, because it's also comprising Ba'athist loyalists, it comprised Sunni tribes, it comprises foreign fighters as well, and also an elite core that Baghdadi wants to deploy his doctrine. So it's a combination of factors. Like, you can almost look at ISIS in Iraq and Syria as a coalition of its own. It's not, one single thing, but they run it very well. The difference between Zakawi and Baghdadi is that Zakawi was too extreme and alienated Sunni nationalists from any potential political process. Baghdadi is giving the Sunnis, political leverage almost against the Shiite government who's been persecuting them. I mean, it's a complicated story, but what do you think so far?
Well, I'm absolutely intrigued because, I keep thinking to myself, we don't actually know enough about ISIS. They just seem to have appeared out of nowhere and replaced the Taliban, and yet they've amassed such a huge amount of territory and following and numbers that they are creating so much havoc in the Middle East region, and they have so much influence in the Middle East. How on earth did the Western world allow this sleeping giant to just grow beneath its feet? Yeah, go on.
It wasn't a sleeping giant. It's just been a build-up of misplaced policies over time, which, local, there have been problems in Iraq, which we didn't expect to encounter, and we didn't necessarily understand. I mean, obviously, Iraq's quite a tribal society, not just a sectarian one, and obviously, Baghdad's ISIS learnt its lessons from the Taliban and the eventual strategic failings of Zarqawi and al-Qaeda during the Iraq War. The group basically has continued Zarqawi's legacy. I mean, when we look back at the Iraq War, Zarqawi's organization posted so many videos of it executing Western hostages online. I mean, that was a new phenomenon. But what they've done this time is ISIS have continued that legacy of horrific ultra-violence, but it has also rooted itself in the local and regional conflicts of Syria and Iraq's war economies. So, obviously, they have a horrific agenda. They target Shiites, Alawites, Yazidis. They committed genocide against the Yazidis, people say, and even non-Islamist Sunnis. However, they've been careful not to assassinate or target Sunni tribal leaders, which is what Zarqawi started doing and now eventually got him killed. So, this has opened the door to increased cooperation between ISIS and these tribal groups. I mean, people will say, oh my God, they're working with terrorists. But at the end of the day, ISIS provides security to these people. They've been persecuted by the government. And also, we forget there's economic opportunity and cooperation because they control key trade routes on the Syrian-Turkish border, the Iraqi-Syrian border, the Jordanian-Iraqi border. That's where their caliphate is currently situated. And this has allowed them to benefit from smuggling networks, while local tribal groups collect revenue by taxing or extorting traders and travelers. It's a long-standing war economy that's existed in Iraq long before we actually arrived in Iraq. It happened after the Iran-Iraq war because Saddam Hussein had disastrous economic policies, which led to the decentralization of Iraq. So basically, Sunni tribal groups have used this combination of economic opportunity and identity-based grievance as political leverage against the central government in Iraq and Syria. And this has helped ISIS this has helped ISIS's unprecedented expansion. People are shocked by it, but Ba'athist loyalists have been able to establish a lethal military and governmental structure. That's why they're so effective. That's what, as a military organization, because they comprise so many different things at once, including, deposing Saddam had its consequences, and this is one of them. Alienating the Sunni tribes has had this consequence. And it's a really remarkable story. I mean, I could go on about it for ages. I really want to write a book about it, actually.
In fact, I think you should. But when you kind of was hitting on a point there about the way that we tried to manipulate who was going to lead in Iraq, which is a result of what we're now seeing in Syria, and yet we continue to try and interfere in other people's politics and ways of doing things, and we keep telling them, well, you need to be more like us, really. So let us come in and let us fix it up. But who's responsible for restoring the vast areas of what used to be residential living communities that are now turned into wasteland rubble? Yeah. Who's responsible for restoring that?
It's the future of Syria and Iraq.
Because here's the thing, right? That's why we end up turning more people against us than for us, because too many innocent lives are being lost and their homes are being absolutely demolished in all of this. Mm-hmm. So where is their help? What is their help? A few years ago, these people cried out for help. They wanted to get rid of their government, and the security forces were targeting them, were shooting them, were killing them, and it was even rumours that there was chemical bombs and gas being used against them, sulfur and stuff, right?
Yeah.
So they were crying out for the Western world to come in and help them, but what these people have actually been left with, because we have just been as responsible. In fact, we are more responsible for more deaths in Syria than the security forces were.
Well, I don't think we have blood on our hands, but I think the Syrian forces have killed more people.
Can we prove it?
Well, the statistics will definitely say that Assad's responsible for it, but the way we've approached it has only lengthened the civil war, and I think that's an important factor. Our support for, our allies who are also supporting very radical elements of the opposition is prolonging the conflict, and our ability to not negotiate a settlement is, and the longer it drags on, the more fierce and ferocious it becomes, and the more our interests become vested in the conflict. But that's the key problem. I mean, we need to have.
I'm kind of going to go off the point just a little bit.
No.
But we're having an influx of refugees around the world, especially in Europe, right? Mm-hmm. At a major cost to countries that are finding it very difficult at the minute, to the extent where there's all of these debates about whether they should stay in the EU or not, and what are going to be the ramifications if they do or they don't, and the cost to these countries that are taking care of this influx of refugees that are flooding out of Syria, right? Mm-hmm. Surely we would be best suited to use that money to help rebuild the infrastructure of those countries so that these people could actually have a home to go to.
I agree. And I was writing an article back in September last year when I was talking about the refugee crisis. And essentially the solution to the refugee crisis, I mean, it is a problem. Europe doesn't have the capacity at the moment to deal with such an influx of refugees like this, especially when we're we're polarized politically. We're suffering from the worst, economic slide since the Great Depression. We have to deal with the conflicts back home, but instead of what gets my goat, so to speak, is the fact we're prolonging and exacerbating those conflicts, and we're like I say, we've gone far too down the rabbit hole. We feel, or our policymakers seem to feel like that we can't change it. I mean, we're staunchly saying that Assad has to go, but at the end of the day, who's going to replace him? We don't have a solution, and yet we can't leverage our allies, such as the Gulf states and Turkey and Jordan, to basically stop, supplying extremists. And it's becoming very serious because it's drawing in actors like Russia and the United States. And you had that confrontation almost between Turkey and a NATO ally and Russia back when they shot down that Turkish aircraft.
But I suppose if you were somebody with a particular mind to politics and wanting to stand up and fight for your people,
how would I
now would not be the time to stand up and talk, because they're just going to out you, aren't they?
Probably. I mean, you said about how we're meant to deal with it. I mean, the damage that's been done to Syria's economy and its people and its infrastructure will take decades to repair. I mean, like I say, this is part of the key problem. I mean, the conflict in Syria may end. It could end this year. I mean, it could end in 10 years. Maybe it won't end. I mean, this is part of the problem where I say, we look at Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya. I mean, there are examples of how Saudi, Turkish, Syrian, Iranian, even Pakistani and Iraqi authorities have been content with using local disputes to jihadists and militias in geopolitics with the support of Western and Russian policymakers. This has produced calamitous results because you can see the patterns. Each country, while all these countries still have central governments, their capacity to control their territories has deteriorated or collapsed entirely. And as you can see, this vacuum of political and socio-economic influence has been replaced by different ideologies, different groups with different agendas who either want to destroy the government completely or don't even want to have anything to do with the government or benefit from instability and disorder. So basically, you can see that trend there of where it's not just Syria, which is becoming sort of like a haven for transnational terrorism, insecurity and stuff like that. You can see it in Pakistan, all these areas across the world. And how do you fix such an array of different problems with different contextual, economic, cultural factors influencing it? I mean, that's the thing. I mean, Syria's conflict is going to go on for a very long time after this because, I mean, it's been defined by immense savagery, violence, and those wounds will be very difficult to heal over time. I mean, maybe you'll have a cohesive state soon, but I mean, it's going to take a long time to repair, and I suppose it'll happen again and again because war is just it's an extension of politics almost now, it seems.
Over
Exactly.
over 7,011 coalition strikes in Iraq, and 3,429 in Syria. Now, when Obama first sent troops in, when David Cameron first said that the British needs to go out there and support them, and then Turkey and everybody else decided to get on board and say, yep, we need to go and defend this and be part of this allied NATO, United Nations defense unit. We were inundated with news footage and coverage of airstrikes and the goings on. That seems to have reduced as far as a news item is concerned, and some people on the sidelines are saying that's because of the response of the general public to the horrific images that they've seen of children and mothers being absolutely slaughtered, and yet we've been getting very little evidence of any real impact on what was supposed to be the enemy, which was ISIS and the Islamic State. Has these airstrikes, has this war on the ground ceased, stopped, quietened down? Is it non-existent, or is it as prolific as it ever been?
Our air war against ISIS.
Yeah.
Well, at the end of the day, we have so many fighters flying around in the air. I wouldn't want to be a pilot over that territory. Airstrikes, the ultimate solution to destroying the Islamic State is simple. You deploy boots on the ground. I don't support that, though, because that would lead to another military catastrophe. So you have to work in coordination with ground forces, but obviously these ground forces will all have their different objectives. The Kurds have their own agendas. They want to create a new nation, perhaps. Turkey won't allow that. You have Assad, who wants to consolidate his regime and stamp out the opposition. You have the Shiite militias, who have their own agendas in Iraq. You have Iraqi security forces, who have their own agendas, which are different to that of the Kurds. So you don't have a unified ground force which is going to necessarily eradicate ISIS. And even if you do destroy ISIS, it's territorial gains. I mean, they've lost 40% of their territory in Iraq, which is a substantial loss. But ultimately, the spoils of war will come into it. People will be barging each other out of the way to assume a position of power because they will claim the scalp of ISIS. And ISIS itself, people will be like, oh, yes, we've defeated ISIS. We've destroyed the caliphate. ISIS will just go back to what it was under Zarqawi, where it was an organization which was brutal, vicious, and operated via asymmetrical and urban warfare. So it will just conduct terrorist attacks. It will sow discontent. We're getting a taster of that in Europe, where attacks in Paris and Brussels are very much divided to communities, and ISIS exploit disorder like that. They don't need territory to do that. So the airstrikes have been effective, I don't doubt that. But at the end of the day, military solutions are not the same as political solutions, ultimately.
Well, with this outpouring, two things. With this outpouring of refugees going hither and thither and to all four corners of the world, have we not just allowed sleeper cells to just come out of a country that apparently they've been training and are now resident in European homes around the world? Is that a potential? Is that what we might have?
What do you mean?
Well, if this outpouring of refugees coming out of Syria, right?
Yeah.
They're now pouring into European countries, right across Europe.
Yes.
And one of the things that we cannot be categorically sure of is who's actually coming where. So,
yeah.
Are we potentially filling up cities across Europe with sleeper cells that can be called into action in Europe at any time by ISIS?
Like I say, we stated this before. The majority of people who attacked, we saw the London tube bombings. We saw the attacks in France. They were homegrown. They weren't refugees necessarily. A few of them.
Exactly. But
that's the point.
But
refugees aren't necessarily the key problem.
National media will have us in
I
fear
agree. And
of this refugee influx.
Yeah, because they won't. Lots of people have to answer for why these refugees are coming in. Pushing them out is a much better solution than having to answer that problem when it's directly on your doorstep. It won't create. I mean, it could potentially the way we treat them. I mean, we have to integrate. Like my ideas of how it's solved is. I mean, at the end of the day, refugees are people that need our help, and I'm a firm believer in the fact also that it presents a massive problem because our society, as we covered before, isn't ready or willing to accept many of these refugees because it will present so many difficulties. My solution will be it's a combination of questioning our policies which have led to the problem in the first place because of our, we've supported the destabilization of Syria, Iraq, and all other places which are producing big refugee crises. But we also have to be able to integrate them properly for the time being because, as I say, lots of these areas of the world aren't looking to stabilize in the near future. And why would you want to go back to Syria and Iraq when your option is ISIS or Assad's barrel bombs? How can you actually ask someone to be deported back like that? I think they're doing it, though, in Turkey.
But it's going to be pretty difficult to be getting anybody to go back.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's kind of really troubling what's happening to Europe as a result of all these policies over the last decades. And, we have the refugee crisis. And I think the refugees crisis has really exposed a lot of the hypocrisy of Western society.
Absolutely. So,
and I'm kind of happy about it, but at the same time, that illusion I was talking about earlier on in this is crumbling. We have walls going up all over Europe.
So here's the thing: we've heard all this talk about war, and we are kind of fast heading into the last half hour of this show, and I'm quite sure there's so much more that you're going to want to try and get out. Because this was never meant to be the path that we were taking on this show. It's just that once you start, and that's what we're like, it's trying to be as informative as we possibly can, and give a real flavour of what's taking place out there so that our listeners, the audience, can get a better idea of what they're not hearing because we don't get much news anymore. So we've heard about all of this warmongering. We've heard a lot about all of these different sides and the agendas that are taking place. Who's talking peace? Where are the peacemakers in all of this?
I mean,
who are the peacemakers?
An agreement between Assad and
look, at the end of the day,
peacemakers.
There's only one way that you're going to end a war is for there to be peace. But why? There's everybody else is talking up war. I'm asking the question: who's talking peace?
I mean, there are lots of policymakers up there who are tooting peace and trying to solve it. But at the end of the day, there's no cohesive push by superpowers for peace at the moment because they're interested in local regional conflict and allies.
Here lies a massive problem. And an even bigger question. If we're going to be sending all our troops in there to supposedly protect a nation of people who are under threat by their own government and security forces, right? And the whole essence of what we were trying to accomplish was to remove a bad government so that those people could have democracy and start to live their lives again. When will we start talking peace?
Once those regional, local interests have been secured, unfortunately. I mean, I'm thinking as a realist.
How are we going to secure these places if somebody ain't talking peace?
Well, the question is about, peace may not occur for the Syrian people or the Iraqi people, and putting up walls against the refugee crisis, that may accomplish peace for Western people. I mean, it's one person's peace at the expense of another, unfortunately, at the moment, because that's just how the world's working at the moment and heading, which is unfortunate. But who are the peacemakers? I can't honestly say I know at the moment. But the key to solving these really complicated conflicts lies not just in superpowers. I mean, they're very important. China, Russia, the US have the leverage to force these actors on the ground to coordinate. But it also lies in regional actors and tackling old alliances, pressuring those allies.
Let's throw out this scenario, Matt. I can't help playing these kind of games, but let's just throw out this scenario. So Russia, China, England, Germany, France, North Korea, they all land in America. And they say, right, you see your law enforcement, the way that they're killing innocent black people, and the way that you guys are murdering people on the streets instead of arresting them, and you see all of this other things that are going on in this what used to be a great country. We're here to put it all right, and we need you to start changing that, because if you don't, we've got ships and planes just on the shore now, and unless you put yourself right, get your house in order, and in fact, in order to help you do this, we've got some ideas of our own that we think that you should be applying to your country and your people in order for you to comply with what it is that we're asking you to comply with. Before we declare war on you. How do you think America would take to that?
Could you simplify that?
Because I think that's what we're doing. That's in our response to supposedly supporting the people who are troubled in these countries, from Lebanon to Iraq to Syria. What we've gone in there, instead of trying to find a way to support the people to get what they want, what we've actually gone in there and done is said, well, hang on a minute. Yeah, we'll come in here and help you, but this is what we want you to do in order for you to have our help.
Yeah, I agree. That's
right?
Not the best solution.
And unless you, we're not going to leave. We're not going to leave until you're doing it that way.
Sounds a bit patronising,
right?
Doesn't it?
In fact, we're not going to leave until you put somebody in charge that we like, that we're happy with, that's going to do it the way that we've just said that we think you should be doing it.
Agreed. It doesn't work. It should be a decision that's up to people.
That's more or less what we're doing. That's what we did in Iraq. That's what we're trying to do in Syria.
Yeah.
And what you're going to do is you're going to have all of those people that was calling for your help going, who the hell do you think you are? In fact, I'd rather side with these people who's been trying to kill me, because at least they know what we're about.
Yeah. Agreed. I mean, at the end of the day, we keep leaving the Syrian people, the Iraqi people, out of the equation, and what they might necessarily want is very different to what we want. I mean, obviously, I don't think the Iraqi people want a caliphate run by ISIS, but I'm sure as hell certain that they also want an Iraqi nation. They do, but it won't necessarily be a liberal democracy run by market capitalism that will run it. I mean, it will be a state that has a very fragile relationship between tribes, the sectarian groups, and different sects and ethnicities. I mean, they're just different places of the world, so you can't necessarily go in and say that, Iraq's going to be like the UK. It just won't be, because there's just so much history and different.
It can't be. And here's the thing. I mean, when I was young, I started off in sales. And some of these seminars that I used to go to, and motivational speakers that used to speak, when they're talking about sales, one of the things they often used to say, in order to spur you on or motivate you or even simplify it, they'd say, even from the time that you were a child, you knew how to sell, right? But you wanted an ice cream. The ice cream van pulled outside. You knew exactly how to manipulate and play your mother or your father or your auntie or the visiting relative, right, to get that ice cream, right? And when you wanted to go out with your friends to the pictures, or you needed extra pocket money, you knew how to manipulate and ask. Now, what I'm not getting is, if we're talking about intelligent, intellectual, international diplomats who are sitting around a table trying to come up with ideas in order for countries to be able to be more profitable, more productive, and their citizens to be living a better life, surely these individuals, who are supposed to be a lot smarter than us, can come up with a lot better ideas than the one we're seeing put down on the table right now, which is do it my way or else.
Yeah, I think it's just an attitude of sometimes policymakers who go into government. They become very detached from. I think people are just very afraid nowadays, especially think tanks and stuff like that, of like suggesting alternatives. I mean, we've almost, like I say, got so many. Everyone's so concerned with the global war on terror now that ultimately, people who won't understand that conflict. I mean, like you say, you're going to be that person putting your feet up to watch Match of the Day, you have a long day at work. You don't necessarily want to have to understand the complexity of the situation and the factors that have led to it. You just want simple, easy news to digest, and you want simple policies. I mean, if a government has a terrorist attack, you want a strong show of force or a response, not one which suggests, terrorists, come from a multiplicity of black backgrounds, and naturally as a result of our own policy. It would be very bold for a politician to say, "Oh, this is my fault. This is Western policy's fault," because they're vested interests all over the place, and obviously, it's power politics at play that we simply can't understand. But the war on terror is just, it's real, but illusion. It's been packaged as.
We went in there, and initially the people were crying out for help. They wanted help to overthrow their government and restore some sort of productive leadership to their country. I'm trying to find the words, but democracy is not what they would refer to, and that's not what we would call it either. But obviously they're looking for some form of leadership in their country that allows them to live the lifestyle that they believe that their country or their environment should be living. And so we've got in there to try and support that. And instead of just having one fight to fight or one battle or one enemy, we now actually have a whole different bands of groups of enemies that are fighting against themselves and each other and us.
Yep, nailed it.
And so now we don't even know whose side we're on and who's on our side, really, do we?
Yeah, that's the Syrian civil war in a nutshell. No one really knows what's going on in Syria apart from probably Assad. Even the Russians.
So, in fact, our meddling in the Middle East have actually made matters far worse than anyone could ever imagine.
Yeah, like I said at the beginning, Western policymaking, Western conduct in the Middle East in the last decade has been a disgrace. And it's brought us... It's not just a question of how many lives in the Middle East we've destroyed. We've destroyed millions of lives, countless millions, not just killed people. But we've actually created a situation which has ended up, where our own civilians, British tourists, are being massacred on beaches in Tunisia. We have people in cafes being murdered in Paris by suicide bombers. We have people commuting to work in Belgium being blown up by suicide bombers. not only has Western policy affected people in the Middle East, it's affected us too. And our response to that is changing our societies for the worst. And I fear for the future because we're basically sacrificing, liberal values, our respect for human rights, just for security. We're returning almost to, how the states used to be run. It's really, really interesting, but it's kind of a tragedy at the same time.
You're currently in Israel at the moment, right?
Yes.
And watching this almost from the sidelines, really. You've kind of got a ringside seat.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to go to Jerusalem. I've been to the West Bank a few times. They don't let anyone into the Gaza Strip, though, at the moment, because it's just the way things are at the moment. It's a fascinating place, I tell you. So what was your question? Sorry.
So from your ringside seat, where do you see things going from here?
In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Whew. What I found really interesting when I first arrived to Israel-Palestine, to Israel in particular, Tel Aviv, it's you enter a conflict zone with lots of assumptions and beliefs, and I'm still outspoken about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and obviously, as a natural, centre-left, I'm more obliged to favour the Palestinians' plight over Israel's, but when you go on the ground in the conflict, your perspectives change almost immediately because you're actually there and you see the impact it has on both sides. Because I've had desperate conversations with people who, Israelis who have lost so much as well. I mean, I'm working with someone in Amnesty International who lost his friend in a suicide attack. The alternative pathway said, you know what, I'm not going to get angry with that suicide bomber and the people who are behind it. I'm just going to forgive them and try and, use that to motivate me to make change in the conflict. But from just that story alone, you just realize, and by living in Israeli society, that, we and the Palestinians, there's so many normal people around. It's unbelievable, your perspective changes. I mean, there are extreme views, and I don't disagree that Israel has some fundamental problems, and so does Palestine. But when you're actually on the ground talking to people, you realize how much people are invested in, people have families down there. I mean, people almost forget because there's so many people with an opinion on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But you have to see both sides of the equation, otherwise the conflict will never solve itself. I mean, I managed to speak to right-wing settlers. I've managed to speak to left-wing Israelis. People are really anti-Israeli occupation. I've also managed to speak to Palestinians, but it's incredible. But it's just so much more complicated when you arrive on the ground. And then it's the exact same in Syria or any conflict you probably go to in any part of the world. Nothing is as it seems when it's written in paper. And I look at my old articles on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I had to think to myself, wow, it's just nothing. It's just not the same. You just have to be there to understand. I mean, it's incredible. It really is.
A funny thing is, growing up over the years, all we ever really saw in the news coverage was the version of events in favour of the Israeli position. In Palestine, they were always depicted as the terrorists, as the villains. And if Palestinian kids throwing stones were made to look like militia terrorists. But I've learned over recent years, and especially with some of the people that we've had on our shows who have been on the front line in Israel, under Gaza also, is that how the Israelis treat the Palestinians has been far worse for much longer than anybody would actually care to state on international media or TV. And how are Israel still getting away with the very same atrocities that America would quickly invade another country for, but yet have yet to formally challenge Israel on their handling of these people on the Gaza Strip?
I mean, like I say, in an interesting country for this sort of discussion. So, Israel have, since the Six-Day War, have been a real big Cold War player for the Americans. They were a geostrategic interest. So, supporting them and turning a blind eye to human rights violations was probably in the United States' wider interests in the Middle East than addressing the Palestinian problem itself. Eventually, that's blown up and come back in their faces with the subsequent, you have the first intifada, the second intifada. You have all these stabbings going on at the moment. I mean, the first week I arrived, there was a major, there was a stabbing spree. There's been a Jerusalem bus bombing since it got here. The first since the intifada of ended in 2005. So, I mean, that's how they get away with it. It's just a very strong relationship between the US and Israel. And Israel, obviously, the Israeli government, I'll say in specifics, not very well liked by a lot of people here, but the Israeli government has very much been able to play on that terrorism narrative, which has happened since 9/11, the global war on terror. I mean, that's partly fed into it. And the second intifada, I mean, you talk to people about the second intifada here and you can see the impact it's had on Israeli society for the worst, and also Palestinians in particular as well, because there's segregation now. They don't want to talk about it anymore. They'd rather live without each other than with each other. They don't see peace as a solution. I mean, I guess what happened in Israel was still very tragic, though. At the same time, those suicide bombings were, I mean, no one can ever call a suicide bombing a right way to solve peace. And people will obviously argue that that's got something to do with the Israelis being on their land, and that I don't doubt that. But, the Palestinians also have their own problems which they need to deal with if they want to stay. Because at the end of the day, Israel are the strongest actor in this conflict, so the Palestinians have to find a way to get that state. But at the moment, that's not going to happen if they don't have a good leadership. And it's a very, I mean, we're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict now, which is not Syria, ISIS, and Iraq. So, I mean, we could go on forever talking about.
We could do. Here's another thought for you, Matthew, because I know we're just, again, time starts running fast and you start thinking about, I had so much that I wanted to ask. We continually, right, go into places like Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan before that, and provide locals, we'll call them locals for now, before they become rebels, with training and weapons in order for them to take out a particular fight. And then find those very same weapons being used against us.
Yeah.
At what point do we realize that we are arming the very people that are killing our own soldiers?
Well, are we talking about Israel?
We're talking about Syria, we're talking about Afghanistan, we're talking about anywhere that there's these oppositions, right? Should we not just walk up to somebody and go, hey, by the way, here's a gun. I know you're going to kill me in a couple of weeks' time anyway, so I might as well just give you the gun now so you can do it now. Because the point I'm making is we've gone into Syria, we've gone into Afghanistan, we've gone into Iraq, we've gone into all of these countries, and every time we've gone in there, we've tried to take up, because I think in Iraq in particular, I think there was 3 or 4 different occasions, different people that we actually got behind, armed, gave weapons to and training to, in order for them to take a hold of their country. And on every occasion, those very same people that we armed and trained became our enemies.
Yep. Can you still hear me?
I can still hear you.
Oh, good. I just thought the connection went funny. Why are we still doing it? Short-term politics without an eye for the long-term consequences of doing it, in a simple statement, I'd say. I mean, like I say, the US has had Assad in its sights for a long time. They don't like the Assad regime because Assad was actually, you know, a key element in allowing foreign fighters into Iraq to fight the US occupation. And Assad even, you know, supported members of ISIS back in the day. So obviously they feed on that narrative where they think, oh, look, so the Syrian regime also supports terrorism. Let's take them out and replace them with a regime which suits our interests rather than his or Russia's. It's all a game.
But it's got to be embarrassing when time after time people start pulling out weapons and saying, oh, it was the Americans that bombed us. Look, here's the proof. And we know it's propaganda because we know it's the militants or the militias. We know that they're using the very weapons that we provided them with. That's the point I'm trying to get to. We're providing them with the very weapons that they're using against us.
I know. Yeah, it's interesting.
At what point do we stop going in, with these gifts, bearing these gifts and being kicked in the jaw? When do we stop?
Well, when do we stop? Well, it's not necessarily just us piling the weapons in.
Oh, no, absolutely not. I know that. I know that.
German. Yeah.
They're all guilty, but that's what we all do. As a collective, we're going into these countries supposedly to help them restore some form of democracy, right? But the only thing that we're going in there with is guns. Where is the democracy?
Yeah, well, democracy, as we were saying before, is like,
If every time your child came home and said that somebody hit him and you sent him home and said go back and hit him back.
Yeah, exactly. Human relations.
Do you know what I mean? So the point I'm trying to make is, right? If and again, I do understand when you're meeting force with force, but to go in there and arm a people, right, in order for them to take up arms and fight a fight that we're trying to dictate and manipulate the outcome for our own needs, it's only equipping the very people that are turning against us. And at some point, we've got to start saying, we don't mind coming in to help, but we're not helping with that. I mean, I'll give you an example. I had a reputation for some things some years ago, and I was also known to carry guns around. One of my sons got into a spot of bother a few years ago and called me and said, "Dad, I'm going to need a gun right now. This guy's come into my house and kicked up my front door and blah blah blah." And I got to admit, for a moment, like the United States of America and many of these other countries, I thought about it. I thought, who's going to? I'm not going to let anybody mess with my son, when I could do something about it. And you know what? The voice of reason was my wife. My wife said, "How could you even think about doing that?" She said, "Supposing, right, he gets killed with the very same gun that you give him. Yeah. Supposing he kills somebody and ends up getting life in jail for the gun that you gave him." And all of a sudden, I had to start looking at all the different scenarios that might take place and go wrong. And I had to phone my son back and say, I can't help you, son. If you're in trouble and there are people out to get you, come to my house and I will give you shelter. But I'm not going to give you the gun.
Yeah.
When do we have the common sense as a people, as a nation, to start realizing that the gun ain't always the answer?
Well, when we stop seeing war as a matter of profit, unfortunately, but that's been going on.
Here's a key word, and I almost think that we've got another show lined up here, because here's a key word. Because as long as America can keep these countries at war with each other, right, then we have an opportunity, right, to profit from selling the weapons. Because where are they getting the weapons from?
Pardon?
Where are they getting the weapons from? Where are they getting the tanks from?
Saudi Arabia, for example, their war in Yemen we are making a huge profit from Saudi Arabia bombing Yemeni civilians and causing a famine. It's amazing, isn't it? And
here's the other problem, and the big problem for me is back home, these governments are getting the nation of people to support their act of so-called goodwill, which is actually a barbaric act, right, of keeping people at war with each other for their own profit and gain.
Yep, profit and gain. So that's what we're saying. Geopolitics, interests. There's much more to the question, much more when you cut deeper into these topics, because, like I say, you become very disillusioned very quickly when you realize that that package about democracy and regime change and liberal democracy, it's all an illusion. And that's basically how I'd like to, almost finish it up. I mean, nothing is as it seems. And I think it's a responsibility of all people listening and, as a people, is to question these narratives we're being spoon-fed. Because at the end of the day, profit, self-interest, geopolitics, interests, states, governments all have their own agendas, not simply just bringing democracy to people.
And that's very true. What's left of Syria? What is Syria like now as a country after this bombardment which took place? And it was turned into what I can consider only as rubble quite quickly. But what is left of Syria after all of this?
Well, what is left? Syria has fast become a new Afghanistan. It's a state prone to bouts of serious internal violence, low-intensity tribal, ethnic and sectarian warfare, and it is a country that has become a transnational haven for regional and global terrorist organizations. And it follows the tragic path of Iraq, Yemen, Libya, and Pakistan, where a vast array of actors with different ideological and territorial agendas define the political and territorial landscape, rather than a single conventional state authority. Such a future, for me, offers scant regard for human rights and a democratic transition. Such an environment means open-ended war and a fragmented, divided nation, and such a state offers nothing but a bleak future for the Syrian people. And it really is a tragedy, and I'll always say that we live in quite an exceptional time, what we're seeing happening across the Middle East. And it is the story of our time, I think, the Syrian civil war. And that's why I'm always drawn back to it, even though it does sometimes upset you quite a lot, because there's just so many vested interests involved.
I think what was so horrific was how quickly it just deteriorated into absolute bedlam and chaos.
I agree.
And some of the images that we saw coming out of Syria, with people carrying blood-soaked children through the streets, with limbs hanging off and missing.
The story.
And how can they justify this in the name of democracy?
Yeah.
If that's their idea of democracy, I don't want it. And I suppose that's what the people of Syria are saying. If that's your idea of democracy, and that's how ISIS can continually convert those who probably wouldn't have thought of joining such a militant organization. This is how they can persuade them to join. Because if this is our idea of democracy, then if I was a Syrian civilian, I'd be like, I don't know why we called for your help in the first place. This isn't what we wanted. When we asked you for help, we weren't expecting our houses to be turned into rubble.
Yeah.
We weren't expecting our streets to be turned into pits.
Yeah.
We weren't expecting our rivers to be turned into graves.
Yeah. I mean, it's remarkable. I mean, if you show me a picture of Donald Trump, if David were here, he could have a lot to say about Donald Trump. If Donald Trump becomes the next president, he's the face of democracy. I actually made a very bad joke about that. I was just like, well, if Trump becomes president of America, I want nothing to do with it. I'd much rather be in the Middle East and just stay there. Yeah. Because, I mean, it's the way...
To be honest with you, there's probably a few people that would agree on that point, to be honest with you. But again, Matthew, it's I can never have enough of this particular subject, and I'm quite sure I'm going to get Linda Sue to arrange another show in the very near future where you can update us on what's going on in Syria and the Middle East in general. It's always informative speaking with you, and I'm so glad we managed to get a lot more out today than we did on the last occasion. I will say the less said about that, the better. But are there any last thoughts that you want to put across?
How would I round it up? I'd just say what I said before, briefly before we went into the tragedy of the Syrian civil war, is that the Middle East is a place that's defined by, what seems logical is actually illogical. And at the end of the day, there are a huge amount of interests driving the Middle Eastern conflict beyond what we're being told by the media. There's profit, as you said before, self-interest, geopolitics, and I think Western policymakers, our governments, have a lot to answer for on the debacle across the Middle East, which has killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, not just in Syria, but places like Iraq, Yemen, Pakistan, Afghanistan. We need to ask serious questions, and what disturbs me most is that we're not asking those questions anymore. We need to change policy soon.
Thank you very much, Matthew.
No problem. Thank you very much for having me on Issues Today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's my pleasure. I hope we managed to get out as much as you wanted to get out of this today, and we'll look forward to having you on the show again where we can find out what's going on in the Middle East.
Absolutely.
And for now, I'm going to leave you in the hands of some very young children on how do Syrian children explain the war.
It's very scary, and first time I listen الرصاص. شو اسمه 18 تنه جريح و80 ميت.
80 of his children have been killed.
أنا دائما بحلم بوحوش وبدوامة سوداء، بس أحلى حلم حلمته هو كنت بطل خارق عم مساعد العالم. بتمنى إنه ما عاد أحلم هدول الوحوش والدوامة.
فهنا كان نزل الصاروخ وتصابت. طبعا صحيت بمكان ما بعرف فيه حدا، يعني ضليت شي 3 أسابيع بمكان كمان ما بعرف فيه أي حدا ولا أي شخص. حتى إجا خالي حتى ساعدني.
من 3 سنين راح أبيع سوق الهون، عم يجيب رزق، قام نزلت قذيفة تأذى وما. حسيت إنه هيك أنا كبرت وصرت أنا أصرف على العيلة وما في معين غيري.
Once again, I want to thank Matthew Williams for joining us right here live on World Jam Global Radio. Issues Today. We've just come to the end of the show. I want to thank each and every one of you that have joined us, listened in. Hopefully you've been informed, updated.
I already did my time. I paid for my crime. I already did my time. I paid for my
I look forward to seeing you again next Saturday right here, back at our normal time, 6 p.m. GMT.
Back in the day, I didn't really care about the
1 p.m. EST.
Survival, it was do or die. I had too many rivals. I was too young and foolish to stay in school. I learned my lessons in the streets. There was not a man I couldn't beat. I was good with my hands and very quick on my feet. I was swimming in women. I had girls all over the street. I was getting money. Life was so sweet. Now things have changed. The whole game has been rearranged. I'm a changed man. Don't need no gun in my hand. It ain't about being no gangster. Life is too short to spend it all in jail.
You know, sometimes I can never get enough of the Middle East.
Already did my time.
You know, when we see what's going on in the news, when we hear what's going on, or we read what's going on in the papers, they keep most of that away from us. But I just want to know who's working for peace.
Already did my time.
Who's trying to bring life back to that country? Who's trying to bring life back into the lives of those children? Who's going to put a smile back on their faces? Who's going to take away the hatred out of their hearts? Who's going to stop them from turning into the next terrorist or suicide bomber?
To you and you, I had to repent.
Who's going to play father to that fatherless child? Who's going to push that maimed child in a wheelchair for the rest of his life?
We've helped